Oh, they're not out here. Kind of a witness. He's coming. Yeah, that's fine. That's fine. Yeah, I got to leave that there too. I gotta go do a report. Anne Marie,
Anne Marie, you're going to chair the meeting.
You know what, Anne Marie, she's coming in somewhere at some point. I apologize. Thank you, sir. Thanks for coming. That's good. Okay, now I think we're ready to get started. Subcommittee on Regulatory Affairs will get rolling here. Start with an opening statement, and then obviously the ranking member will have an opening statement, then we'll get right to our witness. We want to thank the deputy for being here today. Earlier this month, we learned that the unemployment rate rose to 9.2%. Americans are struggling because there just aren't enough jobs. As I have said many times before in this subcommittee, one reason explaining the stagnant jobs numbers is the Administration's stubborn determination to issue multiple onerous regulations all at once. The cumulative impacts of these regulations are preventing American job creators from putting people back to work. As part of the committee's ongoing commitment to promote job creation, today's hearing continues our examination into Federal regulations that are holding back economic growth and keeping employers from getting Americans back employed, back to work. At the last hearing, this subcommittee focused on EPA's permoratorium on Appalachian coal and the impact it is having on jobs in that region. Today's hearing will examine the cumulative effect of a series of EPA regulations that will impact the nation's power supply and will hit particularly hard the areas of the country that rely on coal for energy. I am especially concerned about my home state of Ohio, which is the nation's 4th largest consumer of coal and depends on it to provide power for its manufacturing base. These regulations have been collectively referred to as EPA's train wreck. They include changing the standards of cooling water intake structures, altering the mercury and air toxic standards for power plants, known as utility MAC, and the cross-state air pollution rule, also known as the transport rule. New regulations of coal ash, and finally lowering the national ambient air quality standard for ozone, among other rules. And we have a chart that shows how all this is coming together in the next few years, and we'll seek to get at the impact this is going to have on employers. The job-killing threat posed by these regulations comes from the timing and expense of the various mandates. By EPA's own analysis, these are some of the most expensive rules on record. For example, EPA estimates that the utility MAC rule is projected to cost $10.9 billion in 2016, and the cooling water intake rule could cost as much as $4.8 billion a year. NOx for ozone is projected to cost a staggering $1 trillion in cost to manufacturers, and according to the National Association of Manufacturers, lead to 7.3 million jobs lost between 2020 and 2030. The committee is deeply concerned that as the EPA developed these regulations, it never took into account the cumulative impact of its actions. The North American Electric Reliability Corporation, an organization charged with ensuring the reliability of America's bulk power system, warns that the EPA's regulations will remove as much as 76 gigawatts of electrical capacity by 2018. To put this in perspective, this is enough electricity to power approximately 23 million homes forever. Moreover, according to another study, just the utility MAC and clean air transport rules alone will eliminate 1.44 million jobs from 2013 to 2020 due to the rising cost of energy. In fact, this same study estimates that nationwide electricity costs will increase by 11.5%. Our state of Ohio and other Midwestern states will be hit even harder. EPA should have considered the cumulative impact of these rules before acting in order to minimize these negative impacts. Let's make one thing clear. No one wants dirty air, and that is not what this hearing is about. However, we do need to be smart about the regulations that we as a country issue. It appears from the lack of analysis on cumulative regulatory effects conducted by the EPA that there is a high chance the left hand doesn't know what the right one is doing at the Environmental Protection Agency. The testimony we hear today will help us examine what can be done better to avoid these regulatory train wreck situations. Our economy has been in trouble for a long time now, and the least we can do here in Washington is make sure the government is not causing the problem. Americans want to get back to work, and we need to be certain that we're not stopping them. I thank the witnesses for appearing, and I look forward to hearing from all our witnesses today. And with that, I will now recognize my good friend and distinguished member from Ohio, Mr. Kucinich.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank all the witnesses who will be testifying today about a critical issue facing America, the protection of clean air and clean water on which we depend every single day. Today, we will once again take a look at the role the EPA plays in supporting these goals. Air toxics from coal-fired power plants cause or contribute to devastating health problems, ranging from asthma attacks to premature death from cardiovascular disease, stroke, and cancer. One air toxic, mercury, damages the developing brains of fetuses, infants, and small children, robbing them of the opportunity to fully develop intellectually and physically. Coal-burning emissions of sulfur oxides and nitrogen oxides help fuel our nation's asthma problem and can increase heart attacks. The burning of coal is also a major contributor to the environmental, national security, and economic crisis that is global climate change. The combustion of coal produces a tremendous amount of carbon dioxide, a greenhouse gas that contributes to increased trapping of heat in our atmosphere. In fact, coal accounts for roughly 20% of all greenhouse gas emissions. It would be difficult to underestimate the urgency of shutting down coal power plants immediately for this reason alone. These health and environmental consequences from toxic pollution are why the EPA is developing tougher safeguards to protect Americans. One proposed rule on mercury and air toxics alone would be estimated to save as many as 17,000 lives every year by 2015 to prevent up to 120,000 cases of childhood asthma. One of the witnesses here to testify today represents the American Electric Power Company, which is headquartered in Columbus, Ohio. AEP is also one of our nation's biggest polluters. Another one of Ohio's polluters, First Energy Corporation, which owns the Lakeshore plant in Cleveland, near my own district, is identified as the nation's 6th most harmful plant for low-income communities and communities of color. Thanks in part to AEP and First Energy, the State of Ohio has more coal-fired generating capacity than any other state in the nation. Ohio's electric sector is also the dubious honor of ranking first in the amount of toxic air pollution it emitted in 2009, emitting more than 44.5 million tons of harmful chemicals, which accounted for 65% of the state's pollution and 12% of toxic pollution from all U.S. power plants. Ohio also ranked third among all states in mercury air pollution from power plants, with about 3,980 pounds emitted in 2009, which accounted for 76% of the state's mercury air pollution and 6% of the U.S. electric sector pollution. AEP has also lobbied against the Environmental Protection Agency's current efforts to regulate power plant pollution and is pushing legislation to weaken and delay these regulations. I look forward to hearing from AEP today about how they can justify the tragic and destructive side effects that coal-fired power plants wreak upon us, as well as what steps are taken to curb emissions of toxic air pollution. While it is consistent with the history of big business to kick and scream about having to minimize social and environmental harms they cause, we should not underestimate the entrepreneurial ability of America's electric sector to invest, retrofit, and construct clean energy generation while maintaining system reliability. In fact, when they upgrade our nation's electric generation infrastructure to comply with new regulations, their capital investments will help drive economic growth and create jobs. According to a study by the Political Economy Research Institute at the University of Massachusetts, 2 of the proposed EPA regulations, Clean Air Transport Rule and the new mercury and air toxic standards, could stimulate the creation of 1.4 million jobs over the next 5 years in the pollution controls, engineering, and construction fields. Congress passed the Clean Air Act and the Clean Water Act because the American public demanded it. The American people demanded it because they didn't like their children to inhale and drink and die from toxic compounds from which even the most diligent parent can't protect his or her child. Nothing about this equation has changed. We must allow the EPA to continue to fulfill its mandate to protect our water and the air, and I look forward to hearing from the EPA today about how it continues to fulfill this promise. We can't get into a position where it's either jobs or a clean environment. We have to insist that we have to have both. and the approach in the 21st century that's going to be economically viable and economically successful and that will help grow our economy is to be able to catch the wave of new technologies that can help use the resource we have now and do it in such a way that we protect the quality of the air and the water. With that, I want to thank the Chair, and I yield back.
I thank the gentleman. Members have 7 days to submit opening statements. We now welcome our first witness, Mr. Bob Perciasepi. It's a great name to say. It's like saying Sheboygan or something. It's one of those names you like to say. That's wonderful.
Like Kucinich.
Yeah, like Kucinich, exactly. Is the Deputy Administrator of the Environmental Protection Agency. We feel privileged to have you here today, Mr. Perciasepi. And pursuant to rules of the committee, all witnesses are sworn in. So please rise and raise your right hand. You solemnly swear or affirm the testimony you're about to give this committee will be the truth, the whole truth, nothing but the truth. Answer in the affirmative. Let the record show that witness has answered in the affirmative, and the floor is yours. Mr. Administrator, go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Ranking Member Kucinich.
Would the gentleman please speak directly into the mic? It would be helpful.
Yes, sir.
Thank you.
I'll get a little closer there. I see what you're talking about. I want to thank you for inviting me today, and I appreciate the opportunity to appear before you. When you ask whether EPA regulations will cause the lights go out, I want to be able to assure you that the answer is no. We do not have to choose between breathing clean air and running an air conditioner or turning on the lights at night. The power plant rules that EPA is developing are necessary to protect public health and the environment from pollution produced by these plants, especially the oldest, dirtiest, and least efficient of them. We are not the first administration to recognize the need to clean up power plants and to issue rules to address that need. In fact, since 1989, when President George H.W. Bush proposed what became the Clean Air Act, amendments of 1990, power plant cleanup has been the continuous policy of the United States government under 2 Democratic and 2 Republican presidents. While past EPA rules have made progress in reducing the harmful effects of pollution, more remains to be done to ensure that all Americans have the clean environment to which they are entitled. EPA's recent and upcoming actions to control pollution from power plants will achieve major public health benefits for Americans that are significantly greater than the costs. These pollution-reducing rules are affordable and they are technologically achievable. There is tremendous public support for moving forward with these rules. For instance, since March, we have received over 800,000 comments from across the country in support of regulatory mercury emission controls from power plants. The cross-state air pollution rule finalized earlier this month illustrates significant health benefits from reducing power plant pollution. In a single year, 2014, this rule is projected to produce benefits valued at over $120 billion to up to $280 billion, and to avoid up to 34,000 premature deaths. Our analysis and past experience indicate that warnings from some of dire economic consequences of moving forward with these important rules are exaggerated at best. A publicly available analysis shows that these rules are affordable. This is corroborated by other outside groups and by some in industry who recognize that issuing the rules in the same time frame helps provide power companies with the certainty they need to make smart and cost-effective investments. As we did more than 2 decades ago, we are also hearing claims that our rules will lead to potential adverse effects on electric reliability. EPA's analysis projects that the agency's rules will result in only a modest level of retirements, and that these retirements are not expected to have adverse impact on electric generation and resource adequacy. Our rules will not cause the lights to go out. These studies are often based on incorrect assumptions about the requirements of EPA rules and are inconsistent with the actual proposals that come out. In most cases, the analysis were performed before many of the regulations were even proposed. Simply put, many of these studies are not based on the reality of what the agency is actually proposing to do. In closing, I would like to suggest that the subcommittee should be clear about what is at stake here, as those who have stalled in cleaning up their pollution for further delays. Delay encourages companies to keep cash on the sidelines instead of spending it and putting people to work, modernizing their facilities. And most importantly, delay means public health benefits of reducing harmful pollution are not realized. Thank you for allowing this opening comment. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy. Let me just start with one of the things that the ranking member referenced in his opening statement, and I think you alluded to it as well, was the jobs that can be created when you have to refit and retool and make changes. But what do you say to, and did you look at this idea that there can also be job loss? And as I pointed out in my opening statement, the National Association of Manufacturers, they cite the number 7.3 million jobs they believe that can be lost between 2020 and 2030. So did EPA look at all at the other side? Obviously, we know if you got to retool something, there's got to be someone come in and put those, go to work, putting that structure together in a different way, retrofitting, doing what needs to be done. Obviously, that's pretty easy to calculate. But did you look at the other side of the ledger?
Yes. When we look at the cost of rules, we look at all the different aspects of it under the OMB regulations that we're required to use. And I might say that American industry, and in particular the American power industry, is becoming more and more efficient. Even over the last 10 years, even without these rules, the amount of megawatts that are produced continues to go up.
Well, every business has been doing that.
And every business is doing this. Oil refineries, power plants, the amount of output continues to go up, but the number of employees continues to go down as they become more and more efficient over time with more efficient plants. And some of the transition that takes place when we enact these rules is creating a more efficient fleet of power generating units.
But I guess I want to be clear. Did you do what the executive order requires you to do, which is a cumulative impact study on, I'm reading right here from the executive order, each agency shall tailor its regulations to impose the least burden on society, including businesses and individuals, including businesses of differing sizes. Did you comply with the executive order?
Yes. Yes. Excuse me. When we propose a rule, like let's say the mercury and air toxics rule, we start from the base that includes the rules that have already been done. And then we want to be able to make sure we specify what the current rule that we're proposing is actually going to do for transparency purposes, so we can look at how that builds on the cumulative impact of what has gone before.
Can you look at the statement then on the screen? Should be in front of you there on your screen.
Which RIA are we talking about?
Coal ash, the coal ash rule.
Oh, I see it on the bottom. I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Well, that proposal is out, has been out, and we've put out some additional requests for information on that. That is quite a ways away from being finalized.
Okay. Let me ask you this. Do you think, though, that a more general question, do you think that there's ever a point where regulation can, in fact, be a strong impediment to job growth and actually cost jobs, actually result in the reduction of jobs? Do you think that that's something that should be kept clear in mind as we're proposing new regulations?
Well, I think we have to look at the economic impact of rules under the executive orders you've pointed out, and that is what we do, and we also try to do it based on the foundation of what has already gone by. But EPA also goes beyond that, particularly under the Clean Air Act. We look at the cumulative benefits and costs of the rule, of all the rules altogether since the Clean Air Act was, the amendments at least, of 1990. So let's say going back 20 years. Under Section 812, I think it is, of the Clean Air Act, we do a cumulative benefit and cost analysis on the entire implementation of the Clean Air Act. And the cost and benefits so far since 1990 are about ahead by about 30 to 1.
Okay. Can you take a look at this statement? Because of these complexities, as well as the limited time and resources within the expedited schedule, we are limited in our ability to quantify the cost and benefits of attaining separate secondary NOx for ozone for this proposal. So that would seem to indicate to me that you did not do a full cumulative impact study, because you say right in your statement, cost and benefits, that's what we're looking at. That's the cumulative issue there. You seem to say you're not complying with it in that statement there.
This is yes. So the National Ambient Air Quality Standard is a standard. It's not self-implementing. What it does is it sets in motion a a planning process that goes on for a number of years to identify where those areas are in the country that would not be meeting that standard, and then what are the implementation mechanisms that are used to implement or to achieve that standard. Each one of those requires that kind of detailed analysis once we get to that point. But the standard itself is a science-based standard based on what.
And does the EPA have any idea what that standard is going to cost when implemented? That's the point.
We do a regulatory impact analysis that looks at the best estimate we could make, because all the implementation comes years later. We do look at the best. And
what was your best estimate for this, for the NOx?
Our estimates of benefits and cost went, depending on all the different standards that were proposed by the.
Can you give us a number? On one hand, you're saying you're going to create jobs for retrofitting the facilities, but we want to know overall, if you did an estimate,
yes,
what was the estimate on what it was going to do to job creation or job loss?
Well, we did the overall cost of the rule, and the overall cost of the rule, I'll have to look it up for you. What the
and obviously cost means.
We did the cost and the benefits in our proposal.
But additional cost to business means it's going to be tougher to create jobs. Would you agree with that statement, wouldn't you?
Well, the cost,
particularly if it's a big number, which you can't give me.
Well, it depends on what the final standard is, which we haven't yet decided on. We haven't yet promulgated the final.
Can I just ask one last question? I want to yield to our ranking member. Wouldn't you agree, though, that all this coming at once? I mean, you think about over the next several years, we have cooling water intake structures, utility MAC, the transport rule, coal combustion residuals, the ozone. I mean, all these different things, some starting now, but some more coming online soon. Don't you think that's a real cause for concern, and that it's critical that you be able to provide an estimate and do the full cumulative? I mean, you can obviously see the concern that folks in this industry, in this business, which is so crucial to manufacturing and a host of other, you can obviously see their concern.
Yeah, these rules were proposed. Many of these rules you just mentioned were actually proposed in the past, and they were sent back to EPA by the courts. The air transport rule that you mentioned, the air toxics, utility air toxics rule. Those were proposed in the past, in the last decade, and now they've been coming back and having to be reproposed. Things like the ozone standard you mentioned get implemented over a long period of time into the future, and some of them, like the water intake the water intake rules under the Clean Water Act, or the coal combustion rules under the Resource Conservation Act, those haven't been
Mr. Deputy, but the point is, it's all coming, and it's coming pretty quickly. And even if they maybe have been proposed and they're phasing in and phasing in at different levels or higher levels, that's a concern.
Well, I will just respectfully say I probably don't agree with that chart that you just had up there.
Okay. I'll yield to the gentleman from Ohio.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I think it's fair to say that the utility industry is hysterical with claims that the new EPA regulations are job-killing. In contrast, as the slide I'd like to put up on the screen shows, a report from the University of Massachusetts entitled New Jobs, Cleaner Air says the home states of each member of the subcommittee on Eastern Power Grid would fare very well with respect to jobs created by the new investment in capital improvements. Our own State of Ohio will gain as many as 76,240 jobs to build the capacity to implement the new regulations in their first 5 years. So I would like to ask Mr. Perciasepe, how does the EPA's own risk assessment analysis square up with these findings from the University of Massachusetts?
Well, I have to say I haven't looked at this particular report.
Okay, then you don't have to comment on it. Will your regulations destroy more jobs or create more jobs?
Our analysis shows, particularly on these utility rules, that it will create jobs.
Okay, we're going to hear from industry representatives in the next panel that claim that compliance with the new mercury and air toxic standards and the transport rule is not achievable and not cost effective. These industry advocates are making claims of dire economic consequences if we move forward with these rules. Some of our witnesses today will say that environmental protections will cost too much money, kill too many jobs, hinder competitiveness. But this is familiar. Industry always claims the sky will fall if they have to minimize the health and environmental harms their business practices cause. Heard the same thing from the auto industry when airbags were required. Heard the same hysteria when the Clean Air Act rules were passed in 1990. Ford Motor Company said in 1990, we just don't have the technology to comply with, quote unquote, the tailpipe requirements set forth in the amendments. And yet they started making cars that complied with the tailpipe requirements in 1993. Now, Mr. Perciasepe, can you talk about how industry fared after the 1990 amendments? Are there any lessons to be drawn here with the new proposed rules? From your perspective, is industry exaggerating the detrimental impacts of the regulations?
Well, some of the studies that we've been able to review have a number of that they have done to demonstrate these impacts have some significant flaws to them. First of all, and I mentioned this in my opening comments, they make assumptions about rules that we haven't finalized yet. For instance, on the cooling water regulation that we've been talking about, some of those studies have assumed that every power plant that would have to install a closed-loop cooling system or a cooling tower. That is not what we proposed, and we still haven't even finalized that rule. So these end up causing exaggerated estimates of what the cost of the rule would be. They don't differentiate between plants that are getting old and need to close or for economic and business reasons need to be phased out as new generating capacity comes out versus ones that might be associated with a rule that EPA is proposing. They also don't include the flexibilities that are in the Clean Air Act. That when you actually implement these rules, there are certain flexibilities that are included in the Clean Air Act that are not considered in these studies. So they, by definition, then they come up with an exaggerated estimate of what the impact would be.
On July the 20th, 2011, the Washington Times ran an op-ed by Steve Milloy, the publisher of JunkScience.com, titled, "Show Us the Bodies, EPA." The subtitle reads, "Green Agency Uses Phone Death Statistics to Justify Job-Killing Rules," quote unquote. The op-ed described a TV ad run by the Environmental Defense Fund saying, "The TV ad for this theme features a young girl in a hospital bed supposedly having an asthma attack. She's wearing a nebulizer, face mask, and chest compression device that is rhythmically but disturbingly squeezing the child, giving the appearance that she's in severe respiratory distress by implication from air pollution." But like the EPA's 17,000 lives saved statistical fabrication, the ads are fake. Now, Mr. Perciasepe, I'd like to give you a chance to respond to this op-ed. It's apparently aimed at EPA's proposed air toxics rule. Are EPA's estimated benefits from the proposed rule a statistical fabrication?
They're based on peer-reviewed science. They're not a statistical fabrication. And you're not going to see on somebody's death certificate they died of air pollution. They're going to die of the diseases that air pollution exacerbates and causes premature impacts. Even healthy people are impacted, but people who are more vulnerable, like retired folks, are going to be even more vulnerable to these things. So the impact of the damage on the lungs and the cardiovascular system. So I know you have other witnesses that will go into this, into the science of this in more detail, but these are not fabricated. They're based on peer-reviewed science, both clinical and epidemiological studies.
Mr. Milloy's op-ed also questioned the public health impacts of mercury pollution. He wrote, "But there's no evidence the ambient levels of mercury or mercury emissions from U.S. power plants have harmed anyone," quote unquote. Now, Mr. Perciasepe, isn't there clear evidence showing that mercury impairs the brain development of infants and children?
There are mercury warnings in every state for a fish contaminated with mercury. Mercury causes damage to developing brains in children and fetuses.
So is that a yes?
So yes.
Okay. Okay. Can you describe why it's important to control mercury pollution from domestic power plants? Isn't there a disproportionate impact on communities near plants that emit mercury pollution?
The mercury emissions from the power plants in the United States are the largest remaining source in the United States of mercury emissions, and they affect the water and the and the mercury bioaccumulates in fish, and then fish get eaten by humans. But I want to point out one last thing on this point. The mercury and toxics rule is not just mercury. It includes acid gases, arsenic, nickel, cadmium, all these other metals and acid gases that also have health effects are included, which is why you have to look at the broad impact of all those different toxics, not just mercury, although mercury is very important.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Yield back.
Thank the gentleman. Mr. Deputy, do you think your rules could result in a higher cost for energy?
When we analyze the cost of our rules, and let's just use the air toxics, the utility MACT, as you call it here, or the mercury and air toxics rule, we do estimate that it will have an increase in electric rates and an increase in natural gas rates. These increases are expected to be in the variability of historic levels of these.
Let me just ask, I just want to be clear. So the United States Environmental Protection Agency admits that the rule changes will result in higher electricity cost.
A very small increase in electric costs, but actually the electric cost.
Let me be clear. You say there's going to be an increase in cost for energy.
The increase in costs will still, the cost of electricity will be less.
Is the answer yes or no to increase energy costs?
If I could just answer, it'll be, to answer your first question, it will be, the cost of electricity will still be less than it was in 2009, even with the increase.
Well, then follows out. If there is going to be increased energy costs, do you think that can also translate into lost jobs, or maybe not as many jobs being created as otherwise would have been?
I say it's
and we're talking, obviously we're talking to people who use the energy.
Oh, I understand that, and I want to be really clear. The baseline that people currently pay for electricity is less than it was several years ago, and this increase will keep it. It still will be less than it was several years ago. We do not see it having an impact.
Maybe you're missing the point. What they're paying now, are your rules going to make it later? I'm not worried about 2009. I'm worried about now. We have 9.2% unemployment now. So what they're paying now, are the rules you're proposing going to mean energy costs more? And I thought the answer was yes. Is that what you're saying?
It will be. It will.
And so furthermore, if the answer is yes, which it is, then there could be some other results, ramifications down the road for job creators and businesses across the country at a time when we have 9.2% unemployment.
We do not see the small increase in the price of electricity from this rule, which is not different than the normal variation in the prices over the last decade, to have any significant impact.
You may not, but my guess is small business owners, my guess is manufacturers probably do. When they're faced with a tough decision, can I keep these families, these individuals employed who rely on, their families relying on this, and I got to make decisions, look at my bottom line, look at my fixed costs, look at everything else, they probably do see it as important. You may see it as not important and negligible, but they probably do. Let me ask you another question here. If Mr. Kucinich had the jobs created to retrofit and retool, and you pointed to that as too, but I guess I want to ask, this is the old basic economics principle, opportunity cost. If you're not spending those dollars to retrofit and retool your facility, you probably use them some other way, maybe to create jobs, maybe to do other things. So would you agree that while sure they're going to have to, there may be some jobs that are created to retool and refit, that's money that they could have used somewhere else, but for the fact that you're making them retool and refit?
Well, first, it creates jobs and permanent jobs, and second, it creates all those health benefits I just mentioned. It's hard to get that double benefit.
But you would also agree with the opportunity. It's also to agree with the opportunity cost. When money is spent one place, it can't be spent somewhere else.
The cost-benefit ratio of this kind of expenditure is more than 5 to 1, 10 to 1. The small businesses who could, in theory, be impacted from small prices increase, this is such a small increase that it could be well within their ability to make energy efficiency controls.
It's always easy for government to say that. It's much tougher for the individual or the family or the business owner to actually have to implement it.
They would actually save money and be able to invest it in their business.
So wait a minute. Now you're saying increased energy costs is actually going to be a savings? How does that work?
Well, if they implement certain, very simple energy efficiency measures in their own business that most business people are looking at.
Well, I'm sure they're doing that if it makes sense on their own. They don't need the government to tell them to do that.
No, we're not. That's right. We're not. Okay. I'm just saying that this is what normally would happen in a normal business.
I didn't expect to take 5 minutes. I will be happy to yield back to the ranking member, or we can go. I'm good on time. I would go to you, or I can go to the Vice Chair of the committee. Okay. I thank the gentleman. We'll now yield to the Vice Chair of the committee, who is actually going to take over for the Chairman. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I apologize for missing the first round of questions. Thank you for being here today and your willingness to testify. In your analysis for utility MAC, you estimated that it could lead to pollution control related capital investment of $45 to $50 billion, and that this could create 35,000 jobs per year by 2015.
I think our estimate is about $10 billion. I'm sorry, in our final rule, and our estimate is $10 billion, and our estimate is about 31,000 temporary jobs and about 9,000 permanent jobs.
Well,
I think I'm right on that. I want to make sure. Total annual cost is $10.9 billion. The annual benefits are about $59 to $140 billion. So it's a 5-to-1 cost-benefit ratio or 13-to-1 cost-benefit ratio. And I think I had the job analysis right. I'm sorry. I wanted to make sure I gave the numbers that we have there.
okay. So you're saying
This could have been in the proposal, but I'm happy to dig into this here for you if I can.
Well, if you'd like to elaborate or explain, because that's the information we had, and you can see the cost per job.
No, I see that, and I would like to be able to provide some information for you on that.
Okay. Well, can you provide that information today, or would you like to provide it?
Well, I have to go look at the technical support document and see where. But what I just gave you are the numbers in the final proposal: $10.9 billion a year, 31,000 temporary jobs, 9,000 permanent jobs, benefits of $50 to $100 billion, including 7 to 17,000 premature deaths avoided, 11,000 non-fatal heart attacks avoided, and I'm not going to read them all, but this is what was in the final rule. The cost benefit of this is about 5-to-1, or at the high end of the range, 13-to-1.
So what is your estimate that the cost is per job?
The annual cost of the rule is $10.9 billion, with ultimately around 9,000 permanent jobs.
And so what is that cost per job?
Well, the purpose of the rule is to achieve 17,000, avoid premature deaths for 17,000 adults, 11,000 non-fatal heart attacks, 5,300 hospital admissions, 6,900 emergency room visits, 4,500 cases of chronic bronchitis, 11,000 cases of acute bronchitis. Those are the things that we add up as the benefit side.
I understand all that. But if you're using this as a justification because it creates jobs, we have to look at the cost per job and say, does that even make sense?
Well, we're looking at the benefits of all these health benefits.
I want to get on to just a different topic here. Recently, the EPA announced that it's going to reconsider the ozone, the NAAQS standards established in 2007. Can you explain or tell me why that the EPA decided to review and actually on an expedited schedule? They're not really ready to 2012 would be the appropriate time.
Well, the ozone standard was last proposed in 2008, and it was there was litigation about it, and the standard that was proposed was outside the range of the Clean Air Act Scientific Advisory Council or committee that was set up by the Clean Air Act. We saw that as legally vulnerable, and so it was remanded back to EPA by the Court back in that time frame. We've been working on it ever since. We've proposed it, but we haven't yet finalized it. And it's in agency review right now, but we haven't finalized the reconsideration of the ozone standard.
Are you under a court order to
well,
this expedited review?
there's a stay on the litigation that eventually probably will be lifted by the judge, but right now we're acting under a stay on the litigation, and with the understanding that we would propose it by the end of July. And we've told the litigants as early as this week that we're not going to be able to make that July 29th deadline, and that we're still in the interagency review process. So we're going to do it as soon as possible, but it's still going to take some time.
My concern with that is that the environmentalists, rather than EPA and the appropriate branches of government, are establishing our environmental policy.
Well, we were sued by all different litigants, as you
my time has expired, and I yield 5 minutes to the ranking member, Mr. Kucinich.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. Mr. Perciasepe, the House is currently debating H.R. 2584, an Appropriations Act that included a rider that blocks the EPA from implementing its rule to control air toxic emissions, as well as the cross-state air pollution rule controlling interstate transportation of nitrogen oxides and particulate matter emissions from power plants. Sir, if this legislation became law, what impact would it have on EPA's ability to fulfill its mandate under the Clean Air Act and implement the air pollution rules covering pollution from power plants?
Well, if you make the assumption that those riders would not allow us to spend funds in the budget on finishing the work under those rules, it will delay further. It's already been delayed almost a decade, the health benefits and the certainty that industry has said that they want.
Can you quantify what those health benefits were?
Well, I just listed the ones for the which I think is already in the record in the answer to the Vice Chair. So I will get here in a minute from my able assistant the actual numbers for the. I probably have some of them.
Well, your able assistant is gathering those numbers
from the cross-state
right.
air pollution.
I'd just like to go over those numbers. Here we go.
Thank you.
Number, please.
It's 13 to 34,000 premature mortalities, 15,000 non-fatal heart attacks, 19,000 hospital emergency department visits, 19,000 acute bronchitis events, 420,000 upper and lower respiratory symptoms, 400,000 aggravated asthma, and 1.8 million days when people will miss work or school. Those are the benefits that will be delayed, along with the ones.
And is that delayed on an annual basis, or is that delayed on a 10-year basis, or what?
Annual. Yes.
Has EPA ever done a quantification of that in terms of the dollar cost to the economy of that? And people are sick. It's expensive.
Well, the monetized benefits from those annualized health benefits I just listed, and that was for the cross-state rule, are $120 to $280 billion a year. And
so what's the monetized cost to public health? Somebody's paying. So you're saying that that is the cost.
Those are the monetized.
The benefit if you have the rule and the rule goes into place, people's health is protected, and on the other side, if you don't have the rule, that represents a loss or a cost that's being absorbed by people in terms of an attack on their health. So in a way, and that's what you're saying, right?
Yes.
Okay. So let's look at it this way. I mean, this is the way I look at it anyway. If these rules don't go into place, $128 billion, is it annually?
That's the low end.
The low end, $128 billion annually, is the cost in terms of human health. So, or as you said, if it's corrected, it's a benefit, but it's a cost now because the rules aren't in place. So these companies are making profits. And here's the point. If you have environmental conditions that are aggravating human health, and the EPA is trying to mitigate those conditions with a rule, and those conditions are not resolved, and the industry keeps building their profit margins while having not to make any investments at all in cleaning up the environment so there wouldn't be these untoward health effects, what you actually have is a direct transfer of wealth in terms of the cost of human health from the mass of people to the utilities. This, I think, is one of the underlying problems that I have with the fact that utilities refuse to abide by rules that protect human health because people pay for it. People actually subsidize the profits of the utilities with the public's health. So that $128 billion ends up a payment that people make with their health, and in a sense, it's a transfer of wealth to the utilities. That's just not fair. It just isn't, and it's manifestly unjust. I find it morally offensive. And while I'm with my colleagues in being concerned about jobs, look, how many people and their families have to spend so much of their time taking care of the illness of a loved one who may have their illness exacerbated because of air pollution? Please.
Thank you, Ranking Member Mr. Kucinich. I have a couple more questions. And I just want to say something about what the Ranking Member just brought up. And I think, I've spent my whole life in the health. I'm a nurse. I was a health care attorney, so I'm very concerned about health, public health. And I don't think anyone on either side of the aisle is saying we don't need regulations. But what we need is reasonable regulations, regulations that encourage people to be entrepreneurial, encourage people to take a risk, not thinking that they will be beat down. And when they do comply with regulations that, around the next corner, those regulations are changed, so then they have to retrofit and they have to recomply. The cost of compliance, as I talk to small businesses throughout the district, it's exorbitant, and it really is a deterrent for people to take the risk and to go into business. So I think all we're talking about here, and we're asking the EPA, is to be reasonable, to understand that every one of those new regulations, every one of those regulations that get put into a book have an effect. They filter down to some poor small business owner whose bottom line is, and his profit margin is very slim. And one more change or one more law to comply with or one more regulation may be what puts him over. And I think that is more, and if we look at it that way, we're talking about public health, but we're also balancing it with a 9.2 unemployment rate in this country. We've got to look at this thing in its entirety. You look like you wanted to comment.
Those are very reasonable words, and I think we share the desire to make sure these rules are implemented in an appropriate way. We're trying to provide time in the rules, flexibility with trading, allowance trading. EPA has other flexibilities if things get tight on a reliability front. The other side of the coin is also trying to make sure that there's a clear path. These rules have been lingering for a decade, and we're in this parallel universe of people saying we need certainty so we can make investments, but if we create the certainty, then there's too much that we think we might have to do. And the truth of the matter is, you need to know where you need to go. You need to have that path of where to go, but at the same time, we need to have the flexibilities that are available in the Clean Air Act. And I think this country can do it, and it has been able to do it. GDP has gone up 205% since the Clean Air Act was enacted. while pollution has gone down almost over 60%. These last increments are going to are really going to pay dividends in public health, and we need to make sure we do use the flexibilities that are in the Clean Air Act.
Thank you. I only have 2 minutes left, so I have one more question here. The Assistant Secretary of Energy, James Wood, stated that, number one, electric rates are going to go up. And I'd like you to comment on that. I mean, do you agree with him that electric rates are going to go up? And I will enter Mr. Wood's article into the record if there's without any objection.
Yeah. Well, our regulatory impact analysis that we've done on these, let's just say these two rules, indicate that electric rates will go up from a base that is lower than it was in the last decade. So the variability in the electric rates are going to be small compared to the variability the electric rates have had before these rules are out there. That said, when we did work on these on some of these rules, we definitely used the small business panels to help us look at the impact on small business, how the rule could how small business could accommodate the rule. So we have looked at those things as well. But there is a slight increase in the electric rates that on average across the country, and we've identified that in our regulatory impact. We're not hiding that fact. We're trying to put it in context.
I don't mean to interrupt, but my time is clicking away here. But I will say your estimate came in the lowest of anyone's estimate as to what their electrical rates will do. And again, that goes back to jobs and job creation and small businesses. I mean, it may be a few pennies, but it may not be a few pennies. It may be more than that. And that may be this one single factor that pushes either deters someone from going into business, the cost of doing business, or worse yet, it forces them out of business because they can't meet their bottom line. So with that, my time has expired. We're going to do another round of questions. I yield my 5 minutes to the ranking member.
Mr. Perciasepe, American Electric Power claims that the cost of complying with the regulations affecting power plants will result in an increase in electricity prices of 10 to 35%. According to EPA's own regulatory impact analysis for the final transport rule, the agency's economic model suggests an average national price increase for energy is 0.16%, just a fraction of 1%. Under the toxics rule, the agency's economic model suggests the average national price increase for energy is 0.8%. This is a long way off from 10 to 35%. Can you explain the discrepancy between AEP's figures and your own?
I haven't studied how they came up with those estimates, but I would say that EPA has been historically able to estimate impacts of our rules, and we are even conservative in our impacts on how we estimate our impacts on rules. So it could have been any number of things that they have included in their assumptions that we would have to look at.
Well, why don't you obtain the information and get back to this subcommittee so that we can make an evaluation of their claim. Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you. With that, we will call our second panel to the witness table. And thank you very much for being here today and for offering your testimony or information to us.
Thank you both, and thank the Chairman.
Good afternoon, and thank you for being here. Our second panel consists of Ms. Janet Henry, who is the Deputy General Counsel for American Electric Power, Dr. Joel Schwartz, Professor of Environmental Epidemiology, Harvard School of Public Health, and Mr. Mike Carey, President of the Ohio Coal Association. Good afternoon and welcome to all of you. Pursuant to the rules of the Oversight and Government Reform Committee, if I could ask you to stand and please raise your right hands. Do you solemnly swear or affirm that the testimony you are about to give this committee will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth? Let the record reflect that the witness has answered in the affirmative. Thank you very much. I would ask that each of our witnesses, if you could, limit your opening statements to 5 minutes. I know that the ranking member has an amendment to offer on the floor, and I'd like to give him the opportunity to lead off the first round of questionings before he has to leave. So, Ms. Henry, if you would proceed, I would appreciate it. Thank you.
Committee, thank you for giving me the opportunity to testify regarding the impacts of the EPA's suite of new regulatory requirements for the public utility sector. AEP is one of the nation's largest generators with nearly 38,000 megawatts of generating capacity and serves more than 5 million retail customers in 11 states. We employ diverse kinds of generating of energy sources, including coal, nuclear, hydroelectric, natural gas, oil, and wind power. But coal is important in our states, and approximately 2/3 of our generating capacity utilizes coal to generate electricity. We believe that the current regulatory track being pursued by the EPA will have damaging impacts on our nation's electricity system, as well as broader negative employment and economic implications. Together, they will require very large capital utility investments on a very short time frame. AEP has already achieved substantial SO2 and NOx reductions over the past 2 decades, beginning with the acid rain program in the 1990s and continuing with the NOx SIP call and the Clean Air Interstate Rule. AEP's SO2 emissions have been reduced by over 1.1 million tons. That's about a 73% reduction in emissions. And our NOx emissions have been reduced by 80% over that same time period. In just the past 10 years, AEP has invested over $5 billion in emissions control equipment on our coal units to reduce SO2 and NOx. About 2/3 of our fleet is currently equipped with the most efficient SO2 controls, and about 3/4 of the fleet in the eastern system has the most advanced NOx controls. 2 projects were completed in the last 18 months at our Amos Power Plant, and we're preparing to submit applications for regulatory approvals to install additional controls in Indiana. We expect this transformation to continue and our emissions to continue to decline. We're committed to working with EPA in the development of future control requirements, but we have concerns about EPA's proposals. They include the infeasibility of the compliance deadlines. The cross-state air pollution rule will take effect in less than 6 months, and the reductions in several states required by 2012 represent more than a 30% reduction in emissions over 2010 emission levels. Multiple regulatory programs are going to be taking effect in a very compressed time frame, resulting in unprecedented capital expenditures, mostly before 2015. There would be 2 to 3 times as much capital spent in the U.S. to comply with these new EPA rules by 2020 as has been spent over the past 20 years. Abrupt and significant power plant retirements are likely to occur due to high costs and infeasible compliance deadlines. We expect that between 50 and 110 gigawatts of coal-fired generating capacity will retire due to the proposed EPA rules. And with those retirements come increased risks of unanticipated electric grid reliability problems, particularly during the 2014 to 2016 period. The greatest capacity reductions are anticipated to occur in the PJM region, which recently experienced an all-time high peak, and the CERC region, which is in the southeastern portion of the country. But both ERCOT and SPP have also expressed concerns about the localized effects on the electric grid. There will be very high electricity rate increases, as has been observed by the committee members, and significant job losses associated with the implementation of these rules. According to a recent study by NERA, the cross-state rule and the utility MACT rule will result in over 1.4 million net job losses in the U.S. There's a better way. We would like to see more holistic analysis of EPA's regulatory programs in an effort to coordinate the implementation of these requirements. They can be phased in reasonably over a slightly more extended period of time and achieve the same environmental outcomes. That time will reduce the impact on our customers and the economy. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Henry. Mr. Carey.
Chairman Jordan, Ranking Member Kucinich, members of the committee, good afternoon. Thank you for inviting me to testify today at this very important hearing. The effects of the EPA's pending and planned proposals will have on electricity prices, employers, domestic workers will be devastating. My name is Mike Carey. I am President of the Ohio Coal Association. We are an association that provides a voice for the many thousands of citizens working in Ohio's coal sector. Cheap, affordable coal is what powers the manufacturing base and maintains our families across the Midwest and other regions of America. The companies we represent, both large and small, are proud to directly employ over 3,000 individuals, as well as the 30,000 additional secondary jobs that depend on our sector. These jobs and hundreds of thousands more are at risk directly because of the decisions underway by the EPA. In particular, it is my hope that this committee will undertake a serious review of the work being conducted by the EPA as it relates to the following proposals: the Cross-State Air Pollution Rule, formerly known as the Clean Air Transport Rule, the Air Toxic Standards for Utilities, or Utility MACT, the new Source Performance Standard changes, the new Ozone Particulate Matter standards, regulation for coal combustion residuals, and the Power Plant Cooling Water Intake Structure Rule. Members of this body have probably heard this grouping of proposals called the EPA train wreck. The regulatory wave embodied in these new mandates and rules above stands to cause great harm not only to Ohio, but to the rest of the American economy. Today, coal is mined in over 27 states across the nation and is consumed in over 48 as reliable and affordable power. I will focus my time today on the two most harmful EPA proposals. The first, the Cross-State Air Pollution Rule. The underlying assumption of this proposal, Mr. Chairman, is that our customers, the electric utilities like American Electric Power, like First Energy and Duke Energy, will simply move to a lower sulfur content coal. That assumes that the companies will even continue to use coal in the first place. They could fuel switch to natural gas. This ultimately could disrupt the natural gas markets. This administration proposes to sacrifice these 33,000 primary and secondary jobs that we create, and that is as simple as it gets. EPA's complex rule creates a system of allowances and trading that is much less flexible than the current regulatory framework. Winners and losers are thus clearly chosen, and Ohio is a loser. The only option for those producing electricity in our state, as we have already seen in many cases, is to shut down or potentially shut down their plants. The second most harmful proposal, in our view, is the Utility MACT rule. When the proposals are both finalized, the national and regional impacts will be devastating. Ohio alone will lose 53,000 jobs, and electricity prices could certainly spur and hurt the middle and lower class Americans, which already pay almost 16 to 22% of their annual after-tax income on energy costs annually. The future of Midwestern jobs and access to affordable energy depends on demanding that the EPA examine the cumulative impacts of their regulatory proposals. Oversight for how these flawed proposals are cost, unworkable, and harm to the U.S. economy should continue. In the interim, Congress must seek to enact policies that address the flaws in the EPA's proposals that I have outlined. EPA's war on coal will also be harmful to the homeowners across the country, as the studies have shown in the train wreck will result in electricity prices that would increase 13% in Ohio, 23% in Tennessee, and 17% in Pennsylvania. Now, I understand that this week the House will take up the spending measures that will reduce the EPA's funding by 18%. My concern is that the EPA will simply find a way to shuffle around the funds, and such a cut will not stop their plans to move forward with the train wreck. It is the belief of the Ohio Coal Association that Congress must be bolder. Delay these rules immediately is critical, and the House must then act to write legislation that makes these rules more reasonable. Without a clear direction from Congress in this fashion, EPA will continue its torrid pace of piling on new job-crushing policies. I want to thank you for the opportunity to testify, and I stand ready to answer any question the committee may have.
Thank you, Mr. Carey. Dr. Schwartz, if you would proceed.
Thank you, Madam Chairman, Mr. Kucinich. Certainly, the regulations that we've heard about, like the transport rule, will impose significant costs on industry, but they will also produce significant health benefits, and I'd like to talk a bit about that. Particulate matter is one of the largest avoidable causes of death in the United States. To put that in perspective, particulate matter kills more people each year in the United States than AIDS, breast cancer, and prostate cancer put together. That's a big number. And the difference is we don't know how to cure AIDS, breast cancer, and prostate cancer. But we do know how to put scrubbers on coal-burning power plants. And so it's important to think about it in that respect. And this is not just my opinion. This is a worldwide scientific consensus. In 2005, the World Health Organization said that particulate matter killed 800,000 people a year in the world's cities alone. The American Medical Association has endorsed these conclusions, as has the American Thoracic Society, the American Cancer Society, the American Heart Association. The Clean Air Scientific Advisory Committee has extensively reviewed EPA's science assessment for particles over the last several years and concluded that the association with mortality was causal, that the risk assessment was sound, except they said that what EPA cited as their high estimate was actually a mid-range estimate because there were lots of studies that showed bigger effects. The National Academy of Sciences in the United States has endorsed this conclusion in 2 separate reports. In 2005, the European Union proposed a strategy to reduce particles because their scientific review concluded it killed a lot of people. And their strategy was to impose an 82% reduction in SO2 emissions, primarily by retrofitting scrubbers on coal-burning power plants. So this is really a consensus view of the worldwide scientific community. And the reasons they believe that are simple. We have lots of studies in the scientific literature to support this. We have studies that compare death rates in more polluted towns and less polluted towns, and they're higher in more polluted towns. We have studies that have looked at changes in particle concentrations in cities and changes in their death rates. And the more the particle concentrations drop, the more the death rates drop in those locations. We have studies that have then said, well, let's forget about those downward trends and let's look at just year-to-year fluctuations around the downward trend in particles. And year-to-year fluctuations in death rates went with those changes in particles. We have studies that looked at strikes and found that death rates fell when major industries that were important sources of air pollution were shut down and went back up when they were turned on again. And then buttressing all of this, we have studies from animals that show that if you expose animals over a period of months to particles compared to filtered air, that they develop much more atherosclerosis. And the atherosclerotic plaques become much less stable and more likely to rupture. And it's been done in multiple studies. We have animal studies showing that if you produce ischemia in animals and expose them to particles, the blood flow to the heart is reduced further compared to one's breathing filtered air. We have studies showing that you can produce arrhythmias in animals by exposing them to particles. So in addition to all the human studies, we have a great deal of toxicology that backs this up. And this is why review committee after review committee and scientific body and medical body after medical body have all come to the conclusion that this is really happening. And the numbers that we're talking about are quite large. So the mid-range number from EPA's expert elicitation, or from what CASAC said, says that the transport rule will save 34,000 early deaths per year. That's a really big deal. And yes, it costs money, but actually the cost per life saved is about $100,000 a life. And that's actually pretty cheap among public health interventions that are available to us. So I think that these are important issues, but it's important to realize that there are very important public health benefits that will result from putting these controls on. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Schwartz. I'm going to yield the ranking member 5 minutes for questions.
I want to thank the gentlelady for her indulgence. I'm going to have to leave as soon as I'm through with the questions. I'm offering an amendment on the floor. I'm very grateful for your kindness. At a June 1st, 2011 meeting with investors, when discussing the risk of closures of plants as a result of EPA rules, the chairman of AEP, Michael Morris, told investors the following. As you know, those are high-cost plants. Throughout almost all of 2009, those plants probably didn't run 5% of the time because of natural gas prices. When we shut those down, there will be some cost savings as well, and on balance, we think that's the appropriate way to go. It's the sum and substance of what was said. Now, what CEO Morris is saying is that AEP has already had to shut down certain coal-burning power plants due to competitive pressure from lower-cost natural gas. These are the same plants that would have to be retrofitted or shut down to comply with EPA regulations. Now, Ms. Henry, if AEP is already shutting down these same plants because they're high costs and are uncompetitive in the market, how can you come here today and portray EPA's rules as infeasible and blame the EPA for forcing a large number of premature power plant requirements?
Thank you, Ranking Member Kucinich. The plants referred to in the Chairman's remarks and the plants referred to in the studies that have been conducted as a result of EPA's rules are not necessarily the same plants. I think that we'll need to go back and look at.
You're saying you really don't know which plants he's talking about. Is that right?
That I'm not certain. The university.
Okay, we'd like you to provide that information to this committee.
I will certainly provide that information. If I could respond further.
Well, no, you don't have the answer, so I'm going to ask my next question. If the price of natural gas relative to coal stays where it was at the time your CEO was explaining his decision to close certain plants, and that price stays the same through 2014, isn't it a fact that AEP will keep those plants closed through 2014?
If the price of natural gas stays at the current rates, and
right at the time he was right,
as the time the Chairman was making,
will those plants stay closed through 20?
The plants were running at low capacity factors. They were not closed, and those plants run during times of peak energy demand and are used to respond to needs for additional power on days like we experienced this past week. Having those plants available to respond to those peak demands is critical to the integrity of the electrical grid.
So what you're saying is that those plants are specifically part of meeting peak demands, and they're otherwise totally efficient and not subject to market fluctuations that would come about as a result of natural gas competition.
Certainly, if the price of natural gas were to increase significantly, their capacity factors might go up because their dispatch might be more economic than the gas plants that run also at peak periods of time. But I think that the critical point is that the plants provide both that peak capacity reserve and also
well, if natural gas
supply
costs
other-
more, but what if natural gas costs less? Wouldn't it likely be that those plants would be out of capacity because they're not able to compete with natural gas?
That would depend upon the availability of those plants and other plants on the system to respond to that peak.
Did AEP lay off those workers at the plants that had to close due to lower priced natural gas, or did you find other assignments for them?
Some of the workers were part of a voluntary severance program that we conducted last year in response
So they weren't,
to the
they were
overall
voluntarily
economic-
separated, they weren't laid off, is that what
That's
you're
right.
saying?
That's right. But
So they lost
there will
their
be
jobs.
additional 600 jobs lost when those plants are finally closed.
Ms. Henry, AEP is the author of a bill entitled Electric Power Regulatory Coordination Act of 2011. Is that correct?
I don't think there is a
You haven't heard that? Okay. Are you familiar with a bill by that name?
I am not familiar with the bill by that name.
Madam Chair, I'm going to ask, I got it, unanimous consent to put this report by the NAACP and other groups and about the situation in Ohio with respect to coal and electric utilities.
Without objection.
I want to, are you familiar with Ms. Henry, with the draft, discussion draft circulated that's been dubbed the Electric Power Regulatory Coordination Act of 2011 that would halt implementation of the nation's clean air laws?
I am not familiar with
You've never heard of that?
the specific draft that you're referring to, no.
You have no knowledge whatsoever of any kind of discussion draft that relates to a bill by that name?
I know that AEP assisted in the preparation of some suggested language for legislation that might have had that impact.
That's what I'm talking about. This bill proposes to wait another 6 years before we limit toxic mercury from some power plants, as well as delaying limits on a host of other dangerous pollutants. Is that not correct?
That would be an incorrect characterization.
Pardon?
That would be an incorrect characterization of the language that AEP proposed.
Well, wait, you just told me,
would
are you
have
familiar with this
in
bill
those
or not? You know the bill or don't you? You're just giving me a response that it's an incorrect characterization of a bill that you weren't really sure about.
I said I'm not familiar with whatever it is, whatever the document.
Okay, I withdraw my question. Madam Chair, I'm going to submit questions in writing so that Ms. Henry can become familiar with the questions that we're concerned about, and also she can familiarize herself with her own understanding of this draft discussion that I'm asking about. I appreciate it. Thank you.
Without objection. Okay, I will yield myself 5 minutes for questions. First of all, Ms. Henry, I wanted to give you the opportunity. It seemed to me you had an answer to the ranking member's question that you weren't allowed to give. If you wanted to, early in his line of questioning, he was speaking to you.
If I could continue my response, I would appreciate it. Thank you. The legislation that AEP was discussing with certain members of Congress would have provided for a phased-in program to allow sufficient time in order for all of the controls that are required by the various EPA proposals to be phased in over a slightly longer period of time than is proposed under the cross-state air pollution rule and the utility MACT rule. Instead of having all of the requirements become final and effective in 2014, there would have been an extension through 2020 and a phased-in program with specific levels of control required to be achieved throughout that time period.
Thank you. And this question is for Ms. Henry as well as Mr. Carey. The EPA timelines to comply with these regulations, is it realistic or unrealistic?
Based on our experience, it's an unrealistic time frame for the installation of the very sophisticated controls that are necessary to control the types of coals that are produced in many of our states, including Ohio. FGD systems, flue gas desulfurization systems, and SCR systems are required to achieve the levels that are set forth in the EPA regulations for SO2 and NOx, and also to achieve the co-benefits of mercury reductions from those same power plants.
Thank you.
And those require about 4.5 to 5 years to complete.
Mr. Carey?
Chairman, I would agree with her analysis of how that would affect the power producing facilities, and what that actually would do for the coal producers of the State would be a removal of us from the marketplace, because they simply could not meet the time frames, as I mentioned, go to a lower sulfur coal or possibly switching to natural gas.
Can each of you comment just briefly, because I want to get through this line of questioning with regards to these compliance timelines? How many jobs can you estimate would be lost?
Based on the comprehensive analysis that was done by NERA, we estimate that about 1.4 million net job losses would occur in the United States through the time period 2020 as a result of these regulations. And if two regulations that we're talking about are the cross-state air pollution rule and the utility MACT rule. The impacts are probably more severe than that based on the final rule, because NERA did its analysis on the proposed rule and not the final rule.
And if you had more time to comply, would that affect the number of jobs lost?
Yes, it would, because we would be able to moderate the electricity rate increases associated with the installation of the controls and spread that over a longer period of time.
Thank you. And the same two questions to you, Mr. Carey.
Madam Chair, according to the NERA study, in alone, that loss of jobs just because of those two proposals would be 53,000 direct jobs in the State, of which many of those jobs would come from the Appalachian coal fields because of the direct jobs in the mining industry and the up to 11 spinoff jobs that occur from one coal mining job. So the numbers would be significant in that region.
And again, if there is a longer time for compliance, will that affect the number of jobs lost?
Madam Chair, I think certainly that could affect the ultimately the amount of coal that we could continue to put into those power producing facilities. So yes.
Thank you. Now, can either or both of you actually comment on what this will do to electricity rates? You heard in the previous panel of the testimony that it will raise slightly, but I'd like to hear your thoughts about what it will do to the electricity rates.
Well, the EPA analysis has been done on an average basis nationwide and not on an individual company basis. Obviously, those companies that are most dramatically impacted by the rules bear the highest costs of compliance, and their rates increase the most. For the AEP companies, the rate increases we have estimated range from 10% at the lowest end of the range to almost 35% in those areas most highly impacted.
Thank you. Mr. Carey?
Madam Chair, I think if you look at, in my testimony I outlined what NERA also said was that if you break it down by state, the average cost for electric rates for certain states across the country, in particular Ohio is at 13%, 23% in Tennessee, and 17% in Pennsylvania. So you can just go down the list and all of the states would see there would be regional variances in the cost of the electricity increase, but definitely all increasing.
Thank you. I want to ask one more question of the two of you, and then Dr. Schwartz, I don't want you to feel left out here this afternoon. The EPA is a singular regulatory body, and yet we see so many regulations coming out of it from so many various agencies and departments. I'd like for you to comment, and Mr. Carey, I can start with you, and then Ms. Henry. Have you seen any signs that there's a coordination of or a look at how all of these regulations affect businesses? I mean, one regulation by itself may not be bad, but cumulatively they may devastate businesses, and that's why we're here today, our concern for what this cumulative effect is doing for jobs and job creation. So if you could comment on that, I would appreciate it.
Certainly. Madam Chair, I don't think there's any doubt that we are seeing in the coal fields of not just Ohio, but I think West Virginia, Pennsylvania, Illinois, Kentucky, you are seeing a coordinated attack because the new restrictions on certain coal permits, the fact that the U.S. EPA is getting involved in a lot of the processes that normally would have taken place under the State EPA or the State permitting program. You're seeing that Federal go into the States, start revoking permits, as happened in the State of West Virginia. So what you have is systematically you have the U.S. EPA not allowing for coal to be permitted to get out of the ground, and then ultimately trying to take away the market that the coal could go to. So I guess you could say that the EPA believes that they can control both the laws of supply and demand, ultimately to the detriment of the entire country.
Thank you. Ms. Henry?
The EPA regulations are analyzed in a silo. Each individual requirement is analyzed only for its individual costs and benefits, and there is no comprehensive analysis undertaken. That results in a failure to consider the cumulative impacts at any individual facility, let alone across an industrial sector. And for an example, the suite of regulations that are currently before us include not only the air pollution regulations, but also the cooling tower requirements and the coal combustion residuals rulemaking. Each of those rules has its own costs, and all of them would be considered by a utility before any investment would be made to determine whether the long-term viability of the facility is justified. So it's essential that EPA not only do cumulative analyses within an individual office or division like the Air Division, but that it take a holistic view of all of the regulatory programs that are coming out of the various offices within EPA.
Thank you very much. Dr. Schwartz, in your testimony you talk a lot about the negative health effects of particulate matter. Yes. And I want to clarify if primarily particulate matter is regulated by NAAQS. Is that correct?
Well, there is a NAAQS for particulate matter, but then there are also new source performance standards and, best available control technology and a bunch of other regulations as well. The transport rule is primarily being put out to help states come into attainment with the NAAQS, because we know that particles don't actually stop at state borders. And so that was the Clean Air Interstate rule that was originally proposed was for the purpose of doing that. The MACT, I think, is an entirely different thing that has nothing to do with the ambient air quality standard.
Well, the concern is that there was a duplication in the count of particulate matter, and for the to make the case,
Oh, so I mean, I haven't read every document that EPA's produced, but certainly when EPA did the regulatory impact analysis for the ongoing round of revision of the ambient air quality standards for particles, they said, what if we got particles levels down to some point, and what might be the costs and the benefits of that in their risk assessment. They didn't specifically propose rules that would accomplish that, but they implicitly assumed that one of the rules that was going to be providing a lot of the help was the transport rules. So if you looked at the benefits of those two things and added them up, that would be incorrect. It would also be incorrect if you looked at the cost of those two things and added it up. The transport rule is one of the strategies that EPA is proposing to help come into attainment with the current NAAQS and with any future NAAQS. And so it should be a subcategory under there for both costs and benefits.
Thank you. Ms. Henry, I want you to comment, if you could, on whether it's fair that the EPA essentially double-counted the benefits.
Madam Vice Chair, I think that the primary objection that we have to EPA's benefits analysis is that for the cross-state air pollution rule, EPA assumed that current requirements that apply to our facilities under the Clean Air Interstate rule don't exist. So they started from an artificial baseline and overstated the benefits that would be achieved through the cross-state rule. With respect to the utility MACT rule, the benefits that are affiliated with reducing the hazardous and toxic air emissions under that rule amount to negligible benefits compared to the costs. The costs are, as I think the Chairman stated previously, about $10.7 billion per year, and the benefits are around $50 million associated with reductions in mercury. EPA claimed it could not quantify any benefits associated with any other individual hazardous air pollutant, but they did quantify benefits associated with reductions in particulate matter, and those are the benefits that they claim are achieved through the reductions of the utility MACT rule.
Thank you. Mr. Kerry, would you like to comment on that? Well, with that, since there's no other members here for questioning, I would like to thank all three of you for being here this afternoon, for being willing to answer our questions and to testify. I think the Chairman called this committee. Our concern is always that regulations are putting such burdens on businesses in our country, and given the unemployment rate, we have a responsibility to act responsibly. And as I mentioned to the previous panel, that no one is saying we don't need regulations, but we need reasonable regulations that don't put companies out of business, that create barriers to their success, that, you know, we see compliance and then we see new regulations that require retrofitting. So I thank you all for being here today, and with that, this hearing is adjourned. Thank you.